This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, and welcome to the Loose Ends podcast. I'm Clive Anderson, and each week in the Loose Ends studio, we bring together an unrivalled mixture of stars of stage and screen, comedy and tragedy, writers and artists, men and women of all sorts in the public eye. We stir them all together for you to enjoy. I hope you like this week's offering. Yes, thank you, hello, and welcome to Loose Ends on a big and sad week for news. But with vaccines against COVID, which have so dramatically reduced the death rate from the disease in this country, remaining surprisingly controversial. To be or not to be jabbed against a deadly disease should be an easy enough question to answer, even with a 1 or 2 in a million chance of serious side effects. But of course, you do have to take the clots into account. As it happens, we have a medical expert on Loose Ends this week to offer advice generally about the steps we might take, literally or metaphorically, to improve our health overall. Science presenter, journalist and qualified Dr. Michael Mosley tells us about his series Just One Thing here on Radio 4. The comedian Tez Ilyas is also a familiar voice here on Radio 4, but his latest work is the memoir he's just published, which takes him and us back to his teenage years growing up in Blackburn, Lancashire, 1997 to 2001, The Secret Diary of a British Muslim aged 13 3/4. Tez will be telling us all about his teenage and later years later in the programme. An old friend of Loose Ends, Rhiannon Giddens, joins us today from Ireland, where she's living at the moment, far away from her original home in North Carolina, and performing a track from her latest album, They're Calling Me Home. We have more music from Philippe Cohen-Solal and Mike Lindsay with a new concept album based on the work of the outsider artist Henry Darger. And joining us again today is Emma Freud, and you've got a guest in the studio with us, which we haven't had for quite a while. Who is she, Emma?
She's our first guest this year.
Yes.
That we can actually touch, even though we can't actually touch her. But I'm so excited. I'm going to be talking to the writer and radio presenter Yasmin Khan. She's a writer for EastEnders and a brilliant host of late-night radio phone-ins. But she's joining us today because she's done a masterful adaptation of The Importance of Being Earnest for a lockdown audience. We'll be discussing handbags later.
Excellent. When you say she's going to be in the studio with us, but she's going to be miles away. I can hardly see you, and there we're co-presenting. So let's start with Michael Mosley, former doctor, former banker, but now long established as a writer and broadcaster, well known to TV viewers, radio listeners and popular science book readers for his programmes and publications dealing with all sorts of medical and other scientific matters, including several suggesting ways we might eat more healthily, lose weight more sensibly and live life more lengthily. His latest series comes in the form of a podcast, which is broadcast here on Radio 4, called Just One Thing. Now, Michael, in this series, each week you tell us one thing that we can do to keep ourselves hale and hearty. Starting with the first one is, well, walking a bit. That's the suggestion you make.
Absolutely. It's brisk walking and it's first thing in the morning. Because if you're going to do and incorporate some new habit into your life, it's important that it's very specific rather than just something general like I'll do a bit more exercise. Yeah. It's timely. You kind of know when you're going to do it. So I explore the science of brisk walking. And by brisk, I mean you need to be walking at least 100 paces a minute. And if you want to think of that in terms of music, then it's I Will Survive. It's the beat to that. And indeed, one way to make sure you do walk at the pace is to play some music which has an appropriate beat to it.
Yes, or Staying Alive by the Bee Gees, which you mentioned in the programme, which caught my attention. But you make the point in the discussion, you and your fellow experts, that early morning is a good time to do it. Now, why would it make a difference which time of the day?
Sure. I mean, there are a couple of reasons. One is because when you go out first thing in the morning, you're exposed to light. And early morning light, the frequency in the blue range seems to be particularly good. And it's really particularly good for resetting your internal clock. And your internal clock, your circadian rhythm, it runs slightly more than 24 hours a day. So a bit like the old grandfather clock, you've got to wind it up. You do that first thing in the morning. And the light exposure basically, gets you going, and that in turn should lead to improved sleep, but it also gives you a burst of energy, sort of equivalent to having a strong cup of coffee. And you get out there and you admire nature, and that gives you other advantages as well.
What do you think of this? I've got a system for exercise, which is, it's for perhaps people getting a little bit on in years. You need to have a house with stairs in it, and what you need to do is to always forget leave your phone, leave your keys, leave your wallet, whatever it is, in your bedroom or in the basement, wherever it is. And you can spend a good 10 minutes running up and down stairs, finding everything every time you go out.
Brilliant. Maybe I'll incorporate that into another Just One Thing.
Well, if there's a second series, I think that's well worth doing. Then you go on to fermented foods and bacteria. And now explain the science behind that. Why should we want bacteria in our body?
Sure. So this is really probiotics, and I believe it's available on BBC Sounds as we speak. And we know about the microbiome. That's the 1 to 2 kilos of microbes that live in your gut. There are about 100 trillion down there, 1,000 different species. And one of the ways of improving the quality, if you like, of the microbiome is to feed it with foods which are full of good bacteria. And you get those from fermented foods. So I'm talking to an expert in the podcast from the University of Cork, and they're doing a lot of research there. Indeed, they are the group who coined the phrase psychobiotics. And these are the sort of foods you eat which can actually influence your mental state. So we know that probiotics are pretty good for things like your immune system, but some of the most exciting research is the impact on your brain.
Yeah, so sauerkraut is good. Sweet, sticky buns, not so good. Is that the theory?
I'm afraid so. And there are other sort of foods as well. I love making sauerkraut. I do it all the time. I'm just making a batch this morning, and I should have brought some to show you. I just love the fact that you ferment it, it bubbles, and every morning I come and burp my little babies, and you get all this gas coming off. It's just great fun.
Emma, are you attracted by the idea of sauerkraut and fermented foods?
Not as attracted as I am by the idea of something that Michael did a few years ago, which was when he swallowed a tapeworm as a sort of self-experiment.
Yeah.
Did it work? Because it's the sort of fantasy for anyone on a diet. You just eat.
Oh no, not to lose weight.
Always.
Yeah. No, this was not a weight loss experiment, but I actually swallowed a couple. Indeed, it turned out to be 3 tapeworm cysts. I had to go all the way to Africa to get them, and then I swallowed them. And we're actually measuring the impact on my immune system, because there is evidence that worms and other things can manipulate your immune system. So I was really looking to see if it would improve my asthma and my hay fever, which it did. And I actually had to then swallow a pill camera so you could go down and see the worms there. And if you Google Michael Mosley tapeworm, you can indeed watch a 3-hour video of this long, slow journey of the pill camera through my gut.
The camera, was there a cameraman with it, or just
the cameraman ditched it pretty early on, but you can see all the worms in situ. But I did take a pill to get rid of them afterwards.
So you belong in a long tradition of scientists experimenting on themselves, but they did it perhaps in history to advance science. You're doing it to demonstrate something for TV viewers. Are you confident taking these chances?
I checked them out all with my wife beforehand. She's quite conservative about it. She's a GP, and she says no to some things. She wasn't very keen, for example, on the idea of my deliberately infesting myself with pubic lice. I don't think that was because of the health. But she said no to that one.
Did you do it anyway, then?
Yeah, I did not. We got the assistant producer to volunteer.
She was a bit crabby about that. But you did get into a bit of trouble last year. People took against you. You had this idea that you could reduce your calorie intake to, is it 800 calories or 8 calories a day and lose weight very, very rapidly. People thought you were giving dangerous advice there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This was actually in the context of a series I did for Channel 4. And the reason I was talking about it is these were people who were seriously overweight and who also suffered from other conditions like high blood pressure and metabolic disease. And in this group of people, there is a lot of evidence that doing a rapid weight loss, what I call the Fast 800 approach, is both safe and effective. But, it's not suitable for everyone. Indeed, the government, the UK government, the NHS is currently rolling out a similar programme in 5,000 people to test its effectiveness. So it's not crazy stuff, but there was understandably backlash, particularly from eating disorder communities who felt I was sort of promoting it more widely than that. But this is strictly for people who have no history of eating disorders and who are currently overweight or obese and have a good reason to want to lose weight fairly rapidly.
It's a difficult area, though, isn't it? Because the background noise in dieting is clearly not helpful to people with eating disorders or attracted to that sort of thing.
100% not. And that is obviously one of the issues. And clearly, COVID-19 has not helped at all. It's a challenge.
Well, I think the last time you were on the programme, maybe a time before, you were talking about the 5-2 diet, which was popular a bit. I don't know if it's still going strong. So eating fairly normally for 5 days a week and 2 days of very, very low intake of calories.
Again, about 800 calories. The definition of a very low-calorie diet is something under 800 calories. 800 calories doesn't sound much, but if you eat the right sort of foods, it's actually quite surprisingly filling. It may not sound like that to you, but a low-calorie diet would be about 1,200, so it's not a long way below that. But as I said, the 5-2 diet has stood the test of time, and there have been a load of clinical studies since which have shown its benefits. Again, not for everyone, but it does seem to work pretty well for the people it works for.
Anyway, in your current series, you've got lots of other suggestions. These work one thing to do, and I suppose we can do all 10, but some of them take a cold shower, stand on one leg for a bit, to take a breath, count your blessings. Were you running out of ideas and you're getting, or are these all effective?
These are all effective, and there's a really, really interesting science behind them. So the point of the series is give it a go, see what you think of it. If you listen to it, you can also find more of the science behind it. Do you find it persuasive? Do you find it interesting? But the idea is they're all intended to be incorporated into your day. And I have actually done 5 of them by now.
All right, excellent. Well, I'll toast you this evening with a glass of apple cider instead of anything alcoholic. Thank you very much, Michael, for joining us. Just One Thing is available on BBC Sounds and broadcast on BBC Radio 4 on Sundays at 11:45 a.m, just after you've had a run and a cold bath. Thank you, Michael. But now we come to the award-winning Rhiannon Giddens, who covers an unsurpassed range of musical styles, from bluegrass to blues, folk to gospel, soul to jazz, Celtic to Americana, R&B. Equally at home at the Grand Ole Opry and in Grand Ole Opera houses. Rhiannon has sung, played banjo and fiddle and other instruments here on Loose Ends on several occasions as a solo artist or as part of her bands, the Carolina Chocolate Drops and Our Native Daughters. But Rhiannon, you've recorded a special version of your song "Calling Me Home," which is on your latest album, They're Calling Me Home. But you're in Ireland, I think, at the moment. Is that home that's calling you there, or a different home that calls to you now?
Well, I think about all of the above. We've been meditating a lot about what home is.
Yes.
As we've been locked down here for the last year. And I'll just say "Calling Me Home" is actually by Alice Gerard,
yes,
North Carolinian, a wonderful songwriter in North Carolina.
Sure. And were you in Ireland anyway, or were you there for a concert or a festival, and you found that the pandemic meant you had to stay a little bit longer?
Well, luckily there's already an aspect of home here because my kids are, they live here and their dad is Irish. And so I've been kind of making this my home off tour. I've never been here this long, uninterrupted. So I'm getting to know the place a lot better. But yeah. Well,
I mean, you've come to this side of the Atlantic a lot. I know you came to Scotland a lot, playing in Gaelic bands and music. And you've been in England and in Ireland, obviously. So there's a lot of crossover between, as I've mentioned, different types of music, including, British, Irish folk music and similar Americana stuff in America.
Yeah, I mean, the British Isles have always been a piece of my history, for sure. But I think most of the times I've been playing, in the UK and Ireland have been either with the Chocolate Drops or with my own sort of brand of sort of reclaiming the African-American heritage and co-creation of the roots of American music, so which also involve music from the islands of the UK, from Ireland, Scotland, and
sure. England. Because, as I mentioned, bluegrass and blues, so, Americana bluegrass music, people tend to think of as white music, but that's not necessarily the case at all, is it?
Yeah, that's kind of been part of my story is the discovery that the banjo is African-American invented instrument in the Caribbean, and how long all of the different, there's sort of a Creole hypothesis of Afro-Anglo, Celtic sort of combinations of cultures that have been going on for hundreds of years, but we tend to sort of flatten that out and just say, for various reasons, which I won't go into, usually involving white supremacy, that change the story to, this is a white thing. And that's detrimental to us all, I think.
Yeah, well, because there's now a sort of new concept of sort of cultural appropriation. People are kind of nervous about going into different areas, but you personify a breaking down of those divisions, both from your heritage, but also from your approach to music.
Well, I mean, for me, it's just rediscovering the fact that we given the option, and when the folks of, when the capitalism and white supremacy stay out of it, we tend to mix. Yes. That's what we do. We mix in life, we mix in music, in food ways, all of those things. And so it's kind of a rediscovery of that and going, this is actually what it means to be American.
Yeah. Tell us about this album, though. It's your album with Francesco Turrisi, who's your partner in several ways. So have you been recording it and developing it in this year of lockdown, or was it already on the stocks, as it were?
Well, we had a whole other idea for a whole nother record, which obviously went down the tubes. And we were just kind of sheltering here in Ireland, and he's from Italy, I'm from North Carolina. We're both kind of expats here and sort of contemplating this, seeing the rising death tolls every day, just sort of trying to figure out how to be in this world as artists. And I started, wanting to sing these old folk songs from my heritage. He was bringing up some from his heritage, and we just kind of went, let's go into the studio and just make something with these songs, and who knows if anybody likes it. I paid for it. Like, I was like, I don't even know if the label wants it. We'll just do this thing. And we found this window in between lockdowns and just went in for 6 days and made a record. Well,
we're going to hear "Calling Me Home," but there's another track called "Waterbound" that people may have already seen or heard on YouTube. Powerful, and an "Amazing Grace," an amazing version of "Amazing Grace."
Thank you.
I don't know how would you call it? A hummed version. Non-verbal.
Yeah, it was just one of those kind of instinctual things, it has so much baggage. People know it so well. It was just like, there's no need to even go into the words, and then everybody can kind of experience it how they want. It just felt right to do it that way. And it was a live recording with bagpipes and voice and frame drum all in the same room, or not? They were uilleann pipes,
All right.
So I was just like, that's so. It was cool.
Yes, absolutely. Tell us about the track that we're going to hear now.
Oh, "They're Calling Me Home" is it's by Alice Gerard, and it's myself and Francesco. Francesco's playing accordion, I'm playing viola, octave viola, and it's just the song about realizing that you're going to pass over, that it's time to move on, and I just think it's one of the most truthful kind of facings of that inevitability that we all have to face that I've ever seen in a song.
Somebody described you, or you may have been you that said it. You said you're the cheeriest pessimist.
It's true. Because when it's all going to go down the tubes anyway, you might as well make each day the best you can.
All right, okay. Well, with some gloomy times that we've been living through, especially this week. Anyway, so they're calling me home, Rhiannon Giddens and Francesco Turrisi. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Okay.
My time is come to sail away. I know you love for me to stay, but I miss my friends of yesterday. Oh, they're calling me home.
Thank you very much, Rhiannon Giddens there. Calling Me Home is available now. Rhiannon Giddens and Francesco Turrisi are performing a live stream for Voices of Hope, a free digital concert series on the 29th of April. You can check out sirius.org.uk/Voices of Hope for details. Always good to have her on the programme, and always good to hand over to Emma Freud.
Thank you. Yasmin Khan is my guest. She's a writer of comedy, drama, and the interesting places in between the two. She works on EastEnders, but she's also a radio presenter and producer, making documentaries for Radio 4 and the World Service, and is an award-winning host of late-night phone-ins for the Asian Network and Talk Radio, as well as being a comedy performer with shows at the Edinburgh Festival and on the BBC. So, as a hybrid talent, she's here today having written the ultimate hybrid show for 2 theatres in the north of England. It's The Importance of Being Earnest, but in a new form. She's written a play based on another play, which is set on a fictional film set, but was filmed in a theatre as a TV sitcom with additional performances shot on Zoom and offered to a theatre audience to watch at home on their computers. That's a little bit greedy there, just basically Bagsying every available format, isn't it?
I'm glad you said that, because I don't think I would have been able to. Yeah, I think we were going for as many boxes to tick as we possibly could.
Can I ask you a bit more about The Importance of Being Earnest? So are the actors performing the play, The Importance of Being Earnest, and then there's a story around it as well?
No, it's a whole new adaptation. So I have taken the bones of the original story and some of the concepts of the original story about the name confusion, and essentially about not being who you are allowed to be,
yes,
who you want to be.
Well, of course, it's written in the sort of high society of late Victorian England, where there were strict rules about who you could marry and even be with. And of course, that does, I would have thought, can translate today.
Absolutely. I mean, we have Mina Anwar playing my version of Lady Bracknell, which is Ms. Begum, and she's a self-made woman. She's, high society in that she's made her money from a property portfolio, and she's just as bothered about things and what's your place in society as the next person. And so when it comes to her daughter finding a young man that she likes, I don't want to give too much away, but she has her own particular way of checking suitability.
Yes. Is there still a handbag in it?
Oh, yes.
There really is.
And there's a drag queen.
Oh, right.
Oh, it's really a lot of fun. It's a very clever concept. What's the aim? What was the purpose?
I think the primary aim was, frankly, to start with, to give creatives some work during lockdown and look at what could be done. And obviously theatres, some of them have been quite nimble in let's get some work out there and how can we do it. But obviously we've gone beyond the point of just sticking a camera on stage and filming a play. So this is where we end up with this really interesting, quite odd sort of hybrid situation. And it's not just the theatres that I'm working with that have done this. Lots of theatres are doing it where it's not quite a film, but it's not quite a play. And in some ways it gives you a bit more to play with, no pun intended, because you can do things that you wouldn't ordinarily do in a stage play, like zoom in on something or take a reaction shot of someone, which when you're sitting in the audience, and unless you're sat right at the front of the stalls, you can't really see that.
You've also added TV sitcom, though, into the mix as well, haven't you, using the sort of vocabulary of that?
Yes. When I started writing it, I felt like I was doing A-level Oscar Wilde again to try and remind myself of what the piece was about and sort of the themes in it. And it sort of lent itself to, I mean, obviously his wit is amazing, and it lent itself to a certain type of comedy. And then when our director, brilliant director, Mina Anwar, came on board, and she is also starring in it as well. She read it with her sort of sitcom, that's her world, and she read it and she was like, this really could be given a sort of sitcom narrative.
It's the original that you based it on, Importance of Being Earnest, couldn't be less diverse.
Yeah.
Your production couldn't be more diverse. Is that why?
I think for me, partly yes, because when you read it, it's, when I was at school or college reading stuff like this, it sort of didn't occur to me that things weren't diverse. I took it for granted that that's how it was. And it's only when you get a bit older you start to question that narrative and go, well, but why am I not? Why is it okay that I was never in Just 17, for example, or reflected back in any of the things that I watched? And then when you find yourself in a position to be able to change that and someone gives you a golden opportunity, then why not?
You said that as an Asian woman, you had the triple threat of being thought of as repressed, suppressed and depressed. Was that what you were trying to tackle when you became the cultural advisor on EastEnders, to try and present a different alternative view? I
think with that particular role, I was just glad to be able to go read a script, for example, and go, yeah, that would happen, that might not happen, don't do that because that's really far off the reality. So it was a chance to add to the narrative. I don't want to say correct the narrative, but to add to it and give it, because I think when you're writing about a particular culture, nuance really helps. And sometimes you wouldn't get that if you haven't walked in those shoes, if you haven't lived that life. But again, it's an opportunity to make something more real.
And as the cultural advisor, what sort of questions were you fielding from the people working on it or from the producers or the writers?
I imagine it's a lot of stuff that, for example, on programmes they have legal advisors and medical advisors and all kinds of things. So, I would get a script and look at dialogue, or I would go on set and actually advise on a prayer scene and say, OK, I felt myself very religious at that point, but I would often check things with my mum because, she's older and got more experience. But yeah, you would check things on a particular scene or just even a storyline, just talk things through and go, OK, well, don't be afraid, for example, to show somebody falling off the wagon, because the only depiction in that situation, for example, of Muslims is not that they are X, Y and Z, a particular way. There are all kinds of people, and let's try and show that.
And did they listen to you? Did you manage to broaden out the view of Asian women or the Asian community? I wouldn't
want to say that I did that sort of single-handedly, but I think anyone working on a show like that, and I write for the show now as well, you're able to bring something to the table. And I, for example, when I was writing something that went out on the show last year, it was about a race issue, and I was able to put my very own particular experience into it because it fitted. And I think it's that thing. It's when you start to become part of the narrative rather than battling against it, that is where you can make the biggest change.
So to that little girl up in Yorkshire in the village wanting to be at TV Centre, it must feel like Christmas.
It did. I remember driving into Television Centre the first day I was presenting a radio programme there, and I had it was quite a surreal moment.
The Importance of Being Earnest can be found online between the 19th of April and the 4th of May at importanceofbeingearnest.com. Yasmin Khan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Emma Freud and Yasmin Khan. Music now, and a collaboration between the French musician and producer Philippe Cohen-Solal of the Gotan Project and the British prize-winning producer Mike Lindsay, co-founder of the acid folk group Tongue. Henry Darger lived and died in 1973 in obscurity in Chicago, a hospital custodian or caretaker. But after his death, a huge body of his artistic work was discovered. Paintings, drawings, lyrics and other writing, including a 15,000-page fantasy, the story of the Vivian Girls and what is known as the realms of the unreal of the Glandeco-Angelian war storm caused by the Child Slave Rebellion. So that's a page done just in the title. But Philippe and Mike have created a rather luscious concept album based on and inspired by the outsider artwork of Henry Darger. So here is Philippe to tell us all about it.
Hello, Loose Ends. Thanks so much for having us. We've got an exclusive version of our track, Who Will Follow Angelina, from our brand new album, Outsider. This album is directly inspired by the American outsider artist, Henry Darger, who wrote all the lyrics to each song on the album 70 years ago. The music was written by Mike Lindsay from Tongue and me, with Adam Glover on the vocals, Hannah Peel on vocals, Rhodes and string synth, Roger Brogan on drums, Mike Lindsay on bass and production, and myself, Philippe Cohen-Solal, on acoustic guitar and production. Hope you'll enjoy it.
Who will follow Angelina, standing for the right, holding up her banners in the thickest fight, listening for her orders, ready to obey? Who will follow Angelina, serving her today?
Thank you, that's rather wonderful, wasn't it? That was Philippe Cohen-Solal and Mike Lindsay. Outsider is available now. So let's come to Tez Ilyas, who in the last 10 years or so has developed a highly successful career in comedy, including his latest night Channel 4 series, The Tez O'Clock Show, Tez Talks, here on Radio 4, based on some of the stand-up comedy shows he's performed to packed houses, the Edinburgh Festival in London and around the country. But in his first book, The Secret Diary of a British Muslim, aged 13 3/4, Tez looks back to his teenage years in Blackburn, during which time, you say in your book, your ambition was to be a doctor, so a hands-on surgeon, perhaps, rather than a stand-up comedian.
Yeah, when I was younger, that was my life ambition, was to be a doctor, specifically a surgeon. I think I confused really enjoying Casualty with actually caring for people's lives. But as it so happens, I didn't do that well in my A-levels. And so I crashed out of medicine or any ambitions to do medicine, ended up doing a bachelor's in biochemistry, then a master's in management, which eventually took me to a career in London. After a couple of years, I felt a bit lonely. So I need a hobby. And that's where stand-up comedy came along in my mid-20s, very accidentally.
All right, well, we'll come back to that if we may, but at the period of time covered by this book, I mean, you call it a diary, but you admit straight away it wasn't a diary you actually kept. You've had to reconstruct your younger self from your memories and perhaps notes, I don't know.
That's right, I didn't keep a diary. Actually, I don't know anyone who did keep it, at least around me, that kept a diary at the time, unless they kept an even more secret diary than this one was. But yeah, it was using my own memories, talking to family, friends, frenemies, looking at my old school reports, which I meticulously kept because I was a nerd. And also then Googling all of those life events that happened between the period of the book, which is 97 to 2001, and trying to remember how I felt about those things at the time they happened. For example, Princess Diana's funeral, World Cup 1998, Pakistan losing the World Cup final in 1999, the Cricket World Cup, all those things I had distinct memories of. And then I tried to write them as best I could from the perspective I had at the time. Yes,
you hitched your wagon to a few causes there. You support Pakistan in Test cricket, England national side in international football, and Blackburn Rovers in club football, which you start this diary too late for the best bit of that.
I know. I was almost thinking, can we just go back 2 years earlier? But then I thought I would have been 11 then, and God knows what my memory was like. Even worse, like I would probably remember even less then.
Yeah. Well, you come across as quite a studious and a devout young man compared to perhaps your other friends. And occasionally you do say you're a bit lonely, but it's extraordinary because you give a sort of cast list of everybody in your life, which I think is 4 or 5 pages of relations and half relations, neighbours, uncles, aunties, and added that as a glossary at the end of some words which are unusual if you don't speak Punjabi or Urdu or Arabic, for the reader to follow. You come from a very intensely sociable family and neighbourhood group.
I do, and I love growing up in this community. I think the loneliness aspect of being a teen, even in a big community and big family, comes from the fact that as a teenager, I certainly never talked about my feelings to my parents or uncles or aunts or anyone really, probably not even my friends. We only have had superficial conversations about football, etc. And then I found that my friends were they all matured earlier than me. They were talking about slightly different things that I felt too embarrassed to join in the conversations with. And I just felt like I probably still in my mind wanted to stay a kid a little bit longer, whilst they were yearning for those college years and moving on and talking about other things. But I was a bit of a nerd. I was a bit of a mummy's boy as well, I think. And I was a bit scared of the repercussions of getting into trouble. Yeah. So I tried to avoid it as best I could, even though I was a very cheeky bugger in school.
Yes, there's one or two.
That was my outlet.
One or two rude jokes. And I see you won a Rotary Club debating competition. That's the only indication, perhaps, in your childhood that there might be a performing career for you eventually. But so you say you accidentally came into being a stand-up comedian, having pursued scientific-y managerial work before then.
Yeah, so I moved to London because I got on the graduate programme in the civil service and they put me in the Home Office. And so I was working here for a couple of years. And then I thought, I just need a hobby. I thought about finding a creative writing course, just something to do in the evenings, meet new people, that sort of thing. And then while I was doing that, I completely accidentally came across a stand-up workshop. And I thought, my friends always tell me I'm funny. I'm deluded enough to believe them. Maybe I should just give this a go. Worst case scenario, I'll make a fool of myself, meet new people. I can live with both of those things. And so I did that. At the end of the workshop, it was everyone who was on it invited their friends to the showcase gig. That went well. People laughed mostly in the places that I wanted them to laugh. And then after that, I just threw myself into the open mic world, which, as you know, is a fascinating subculture in itself.
Sure, but and we've developed your show's Tez Talk, so it's a stand-up comedy, but you do like to, there's an echo of TED Talks there. You do like to address serious issues. There's one thing you go into is saying, well, you obviously criticise racism, but you sort of say, well, you don't want to get rid of it all altogether because your act depends upon there being a little bit of racism, but not so much that you can't walk down the street and enjoy yourself, so to speak.
Yeah, enough racism that I get invited back onto Mock the Week because they feel guilty about it. but not so much racism that someone might throw a punch in my face while I'm walking down the street.
Yeah.
There's a middle ground there.
Yeah. Well, it's all gone very well for you. I just should mention one hiccup. You were a part of the Live Comedy Association. You resigned last year, saying you recognise unacceptable behaviour in yourself towards women. That's an interesting admission, or facing up to facts. Is that something that's sort of grown up because of the world of show business that you were in?
Yeah, I think anyone who cares about any sort of world thing, such as sexism or Black Lives Matter, if you're a non-Black person, if you're not directly affected by it, I think it's important, if you care about those things, to have an element of self-reflection, an element of looking at your own behaviour before you can, try and hit yourself to any sort of cause. And that's what I did. And for me, for now, it's, I'm going to shut up, listen, and learn as best I can.
Yes.
Going forward.
And so you've learned something and moved on. Is that your...
That is right. And I'll continue to learn as we go forward.
All right. So we can learn something of your life, but by extension, the life of a whole community of people in the north of England with a Muslim Pakistani background. Meanwhile, your diary takes up, I think you get to be 18 3/4. There's another 10 years of the development, or the 10 years as a comedian that you could be covering in your pretend diaries.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a sequel, maybe perhaps set at the 4 years that I had at university, and then the civil service career is a whole different ball game as well. It's just there are a lot of things to cover.
Tez Ilyas, the civil service years. I can see it as a bestseller.
the uncivil servant.
Excellent. You've got a title and everything. So, The Secret Diary of a British Muslim, aged 13 3/4, is available now. That's the Loose Ends tied up for this week. Thank you for listening. Previous Loose Ends interviews can be found on the BBC Sounds app, including last week's show, which featured Linda LaPlante, the queen of TV fiction, and Liso Shaponda, the king of Malawian comedy. But my thanks to all of this week's guests: Tez Ilyas, Michael Mosley, Rhiannon Giddens, Philip Cohen-Solel and Mike Lindsay, Emma Freud and Yasmin Khan. Today's producer was Suki Firth, the studio manager Gail Gordon. Next week my guests will include Emma Kennedy and Kate Humble. Until then, from me for now, goodbye. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. You can listen to many more podcasts on BBC Sounds. And to hear the full live music performances, head to the Loose Ends website.